What has eroded confidence in our institutions? Those guardrails, the constitutional guardrails, the republicanism of the system. George points out how the founders were so emphatically in favor of popular government that they did everything they could to try to protect it. I agree completely, that's quite right. But they did so by building in protections against mere majoritarianism. They were understandably concerned that they didn't want to recreate an Athens for one reason only. There is no constitution in majority rule, period. So how did we lose our character? Well, somehow it seems to me it started when we lost faith in all those institutional guardrails, the very republicanism itself. We announced that in 1938 when we said in Caroline Product's case that minorities cannot be protected by majority rule in this system. And ever since then, we've been elaborating a structure in which we try to discriminate protected from unprotected classes. And what does that mean except to communicate that some people shouldn't have confidence in the government? And eventually that means no one should have confidence in the system. So I think we have a much deeper problem than the problem of technology, of the online communication. The whole idea of whether the problem is the people know too much or the people know too little, it seems to me is quite beside the point. The fact is, what the people know is not comforting. And we must explore the reasons why what the people know is not comforting.
At the heart of this, Jeff, and then I'll subside, is a peculiar and simple-minded understanding of representation. Josh Hawley, when asked why he was doing this, challenging this, as well, the people of Missouri want it. So that's a sufficient explanation. Even if true, of course, it's insufficient, and Mr. Hawley should be sent to his room without dessert and required to read several times Burke's speech to the electors at Bristol, where he said, "I owe you my judgment. I don't check my judgment at the door and simply respond to promptings from you folks." So at the heart of this is an entire rejection in the name of populism of separation of powers, the structure that exists to encourage prudence and compromise, and finally, a simple and, as I say, simple-minded understanding of representation.
And it was the system itself, the institutions of Congress, the neutral institutions. The Congress is, of course, a very political place, but the actual institution is bipartisan. We all share it. We all elect people to go and sit in it. And it's very clear that a part of the American electorate has lost its respect for our neutral and shared institutions. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that. We could spend the rest of this hour speaking about them. I would point to, let me talk about one of them, which is the effect that online and media polarization has on the electorate. The fact that we all now live in separate filter bubbles, that what I see in Google is different from what you see when you Google the same thing. The fact that we are so deeply divided by where we get our information, what it is. One of the impacts of polarization is that it, by definition, makes people suspicious of those shared institutions. Because if you come to see your political opponents as fundamentally evil, or fundamentally wrong, or fundamentally illegitimate, then the institutions that they occupy or work in also become illegitimate. So we now have a portion of the American electorate that has lost that Republican virtue, that faith in these bipartisan and shared institutions, and which sees Congress, the White House, the CIA, the State Department, the institutions, the officials in 50 states who count votes, the electoral system itself as evil.
In terms of what kinds of institutional reforms have existed in other countries, I mean, I think we of course, as viewers of this know, we have a very old constitution, the oldest written constitution, and a lot of the countries that we're talking about in Western Europe, for instance, have new constitutions. And there's a lot of virtues to having our old constitution. But one interesting dynamic is that over the course of the post-45 period in a lot of Western Europe, a lot of these kind of older institutions have been reformed. Think of the House of Lords being weakened in recent years, or a Swedish upper chamber. I mean, there are a lot of institutional reforms, a lot of activity in the changing of institutions, renewing of institutions. And I think, as important as our Constitution is, and as well as it served us, I think we should also be open to the possibility that at times we need to update our institutions. I mean, what we are not, our Constitution we cannot treat it as if it's the most unique thing in the world and that nobody, and that it can't be touched. I mean, it's difficult, of course, to reform our Constitution, but it's happened before the beginning of the 20th century. And I know a lot of people don't think a lot of the progressive reforms were all great, but on the other hand, the 20th century was a pretty good century for the United States, and I think it was in no small part to the institutional reforms that clustered at the beginning of the 20th century. And I think the time is ripe for us to begin to rethink some of these reforms and to essentially put us in the same category as a lot of other advanced democracies.